Well, good morning. This is the Lew Rockwell Show, and great to have as our guest this morning Mr. Gerald Celente. So Gerald is founder and director of the Trends Research Institute. He's publisher of the Trends Journal. He's a famous prognosticator, an analyst. But Gerald, before we get into what the power elite is doing to us with the banks, with the Fed, with the wars, with the police state, and their terroristic war on terror and all the rest of the things, tell us what the heck has happened with MF Global. MF Global stole a lot of your money. Nothing's happened to John Corzine, the CEO, or the rest of the guys there. But more important, what's happened to your money? Have you gotten it back?
I've gotten a little over 90% back, Lou.
Well, okay.
So that's, so they stole 10%. The VIG, as we used to call it in the old days. But, as you said, no one has been prosecuted.
No.
Not even brought up on, for charges. Nothing. And not, as you well know, not one head on Wall Street has rolled with all the criminal activity that's been proven. Because when we look at the fines that the Goldman Sachs gang has paid, and JP Morgan Chase and the rest of them, in the hundreds of millions of dollars, chump change, of course, considering what they've stolen and what they've gotten away with. And when they do pay these fines, of course, they always come with the caveat that we neither admit nor deny any wrongdoing. So it's what's the word justice is being misspelled. It's Justus, just us. They could have free ride.
And of course, this is true of all the big banks, all of Wall Street, the whole financial sector can do no wrong. And of course, also is massively subsidized by the Federal Reserve.
Yes. There's a there's a headline into the New York Times Wednesday, May 29th. They call themselves the paper of record. I call it the toilet paper of record. Central banks act with a new boldness to revitalize economies. How about central banks act with reckless abandonment to revitalize economies? Wouldn't that be the more appropriate headline?
Well, it's so ironic. John Maynard Keynes called for a world currency. He called it the Bancor. And he said, with a world currency, a single world currency, all the banks and the countries could inflate and nobody could get out of it. There would be no escape. And so, of course, that's what we sort of see Keynes's dream, our nightmare, coming true today. All the central banks are cooperating with the Fed, and whether it's the Bank of England or the Bank of Japan or the European Central Bank, the Swiss Central Bank, all the rest of them seem to have just gone insane, although I guess not from the standpoint of the establishment, but from the standpoint of the regular guy. They're slitting his throat.
Well, obviously, but again, and that's why they're able to keep this Ponzi scheme going, because they're all in on it. So as the United States devalues its currency, well, so too is the Bank of England, the Bank of Japan, as you point out, all of the European Central Bank with Mario Draghi and the endless buying up of bonds and the long-term refinancing operations and what's the other one they call it? Ongoing monetary transactions. So they're all doing it, and that's what's keeping the game alive. And at some point, it's going to have to collapse.
Gerald, is there going to be a full-scale war in Syria? I mean, of course, there already is a full-scale war inside Syria. But will the U.S. invade? Will the U.S. Send troops?
I don't know if they'll send troops, but it appears that the next phase is the so-called no-fly zone. Remember that was made famous, by the way, under, I think it was Bill Clinton, back in the day when every time he'd get caught in a scandal, there would be a wag the dog moment, and no-fly zones were all over Iraq. And so that's the precursor into all-out war. And that's what happened in Libya as well. As we saw, first they did the no-fly zone, and then they bombed the hell out of the place. And I think that's what's going on. And the hypocrisy, Lou, is just beyond the belief. When the Russians, of course, are supplying Syria with missiles from a contract that they had going back to 2007. And now we've heard from the psychopaths of the European Union that they are now going to be supplying the so-called Syrian rebels with armaments. They're making it public now. And now they're coming out, Israel's coming out against it, all of the European Union, the United States, that little clown on the State Department, I watched him last night talking about, I forget his name, that's the flack. but he can't speak a complete sentence without having to look down at his notes several times, condemning Russia for supplying missile systems to Syria as all of NATO, and being pushed, by the way, by Germany. I guess they can't get over their Heil Hitler trip, for more and more armaments going to the Syrian rebels. Now, let me get this straight. It's okay to overthrow the government via the rebels and NATO supplying all the armaments, but it's not okay for Russia to supply missiles to the government that's now there.
And of course, the Russian missiles are defensive missiles.
Exactly.
These are not offensive weapons, unlike, of course, what NATO was supplying to the so-called rebels, the Al-Qaeda rebels.
Yeah, the Al-Nusra, the form of Al-Qaeda, all these Al's around there. And then people forget the history of this, is these are the people that were created by Jimmy Carter and Ronald Reagan, the so-called Mujahideen that they built up in the proxy war against Russia and Afghanistan back in the late 1970s and early 1980s. And they just keep funding them. And then the other thing that's so astounding to me is what just happened in the UK with this fellow killing a British soldier and them calling it terrorism. And I'm watching all of these people on the BBC railing out against the terrorism that's hit the UK with this one soldier that was killed by a guy that clearly said that he was doing it as a reprisal. Again, if it's true or not, I don't know, but just from what the statements that came out and him reading the statement about the 10,000 troops that the UK has in Afghanistan and the atrocities they've committed in Iraq and, of course, in Libya. Now, let me get this straight. It's okay for the UK and the US and NATO to invade foreign countries, but it's not okay when the people in those foreign countries, the sympathizers of those countries, retaliate. Is that the way it goes?
And of course, the UK is funding the killing of Syrian soldiers. That's okay.
That's okay.
Yeah.
That's okay. It's okay for them to invade Afghanistan? I mean, it's okay to destroy Iraq?
It's like here at home, the U.S. government is above the law and uses the law against the rest of us, but the law doesn't apply to it. So with international law, so that it can do anything, but nothing can be done to it. It's, of course, a horrific crime if anything happens to the U.S., but the U.S. can slit everybody else's throat, and why that's just justice or just us.
Yeah, and the other one is they're terrorists when they retaliate, or as we used to say in the Bronx, payback's a bitch. But the United States and the UK and NATO, they're not terrorists for invading sovereign nations and killing literally millions of people. They're not terrorists. I
think, noticed this with Israel, where they called anybody who was doing anything to Israel a terrorist. But the original definition of terrorism is still the official State Department definition of terrorism, is attacks on civilians or civilian targets in order to bring about political change or threats of attacks. And of course, this is what the U.S. and its allies do every day. By this definition, killing a soldier can't be an act of terrorism. No, maybe murder, it's maybe evil and so forth and other things, but it's not terrorism by their own definition. But their own definition, again, doesn't apply to them. It only applies to other people. Well,
that's a great point. Yeah, that's true. And on this whole thing, as we're talking about the economy and we're talking about war and where it's all leading, as I've said many times before, history is merely repeating itself. It's the crash of 1929, the Great Depression. We're in a depression.
Yes.
Greece is in it. They still don't call what's going on in Greece and Spain and Portugal and Ireland, with one of the unemployment rates approaching 30% officially, like 60% among youth unemployment. They still call it a recession. It's not a depression. And trade wars and currency wars. We have them going on right now. And then world war. That's where they're taking us. And I am really firmly now speaking out and getting every one politician that I can to also join the crusade, if you will, to stop this madness and to rebuild America. The numbers coming out now is showing that it's costing us essentially $6 trillion, that's with a T, to fight the losing wars in Afghanistan and Iraq. And of course, we know who's doing it. It's the psychopaths from the military-industrial complex that General Dwight D. Eisenhower warned us about that were taking over the country. So we're just filling their needs and the crazy people that are sending us there. We need to rebuild this country. And when you think, what could $6 trillion have done to rebuild America? I'm over here in colonial Kingston, New York, about an hour and 45 minutes north of New York City. And you go 6 blocks away from here, you could be in the depths of Detroit when you see the people sitting outside the dilapidated houses. This was a grand city at one time. You go upstate further up, boy, you wouldn't recognize these towns that were once flourishing places. As we've exported all our manufacturing and the intelligence that we had to do it to slave labor countries. We need to bring the troops home and the money back to America to rebuild this country. I picked up the toilet paper of record the day after Memorial Day. They had on the front page a picture of a woman and a baby dressed up in battle fatigues, kneeling before a tombstone of her husband, with a calm look on her face and a smile on the baby's face. You want to talk about propaganda? How about the headline reading, "Dying for no reason at all"? This isn't a Memorial Day for the troops that have been sent to protect our nation. This is a Memorial Day to continue the immorality of the United States invading foreign countries, slaughtering innocent people, and really using our troops as the true GIs. What's the term GI? What is it? General issue? Or what does GI mean? It's nothing. It's just using them for cannon fodder. When are we going to stop this madness?
No, Gerald, you're right. And of course, Memorial Day was originally Decoration Day. It was when people would put flowers on the graves of the dead and mourn the dead. Instead, it's become a celebration of war, a celebration of current veterans, but more to the point, a celebration of the U.S. empire. Nothing like what the original purpose of Memorial Day was. And so, yeah, you have people crazily dressing in combat fatigues and camouflage. By the way, why do troops, this happened in Boston too, why are National Guard or other American troops wearing desert camouflage in the middle of an American city? Of course, it's propaganda. It has nothing to do with anything else. But the propaganda is so huge, so amazing, so, I would say, stupid. I mean, the arguments are fundamentally stupid, yet they seem to convince most Americans.
Well, most Americans, I mean, look, again, it's the most Americans are the ones that'll drink a phosphorescent Slurpee if you could advertise it properly. I mean, they think Budweiser is real beer, So, but what I'm saying is I agree with you. But we don't have to go for most Americans because, as you well know, what did the Revolutionary War, at the height, what was about 25% of the people were actively fighting it, another 20% supporting it. We don't need the majority. We need a moral minority. And I believe that we have it. And the time for a revolution is now. And of course, not a violent one of the heart, the mind, the spirit, and the intellect of the country. And by the way, that's why I bought I now have the 3 of the buildings, pre-Revolutionary War stone buildings, on the most historic corner in the United States. The only place where there's a pre-Revolutionary War stone building on each corner. And then, of course, Kingston, New York, we had the roots of the revolution here. And I like to see the second one. And again, it can be done. All we have to do is refocus our resources that we're squandering around the world in this military madness and rebuild and restore America. And that's what I want to do. That's the campaign that I'm pushing for all the politicians that I know. Restore America. Bring it back to its greatness. Look, I'm not, a kid. I know that this country did terrible things in the past. With slavery and what we did with other issues, slaughtering the Native Americans. I'm aware of that. But this country had a lot of great things about it too. And it's time to bring back the greatness and to restore the country to the way it was meant. Everything that the founding fathers built this country upon has been desecrated by these little chicken hawks and weenies, the Bushes, the Obamas, the Clintons, these guys that never fought a day in their lives that are now desecrating everything upon which this country was founded upon and setting it off in a direction of destruction. Who are they to tell us what to do? It's time that we say, look, you guys, every time during election time, you play the role, well, you know, I'm elected by the people and we're here to do what you want us to do. Baloney. You're only doing what the people that give you the money to tell you what to do. Now we're telling you what to do. You want to be a public official? Here's the route you should take. It's up to us to tell them. And I believe, again, the first step, nothing is going to happen, Lew, until we respect what one of the great generals of the United States, George Washington, said in his farewell address about not becoming involved in foreign entanglements. Until that happens, this country keeps going down the crapper.
So, Gerald, people who agree with you agree that obviously the country does need to be taken back from the people who are destroying it. But it's important also for these people, middle-class people, not themselves to be destroyed personally and financially. What can you do if you're a middle-class guy, you have a family, you're worried very much about the economic future, you're fighting for the ideals that we're discussing today? What do? Do you just leave your money in the bank? What can you do as an individual?
Well, again, I don't give financial advice. On the money end, I continue to buy gold. And as I mentioned to you, I'm buying historic buildings. You know, I'm not a real estate guy. But I'm buying them also knowing that the only reason we have any kind of recovery at all is, number one, the stimulus, which is really just printing money. There's a clean word for it. And the second one are record low interest rates. Lew, I just got a 15-year locked-in mortgage on one of these buildings at 2.85%. I mean, come on. I mean, you know, so it's ridiculous for me not to borrow money if I could afford to pay it back. So I'm using their system. So number two, I mean, here you are. I'm looking at you. You're dressed, refined man, well-groomed and in shape. And both of us aren't kids anymore. And look at, as we used to say in Italian in the neighborhood, look at the caffones, the way they dress, the way they talk, the way they act. For people to regain their own self-respect, it doesn't take anything to dress up. If you could put on crappy clothes, you could put on nice clothes. And it doesn't mean designer clothes. But even if you want designer clothes, guess what? You could buy them at the Goodwill, Salvation Army, or thrift shops on pennies on the dollar. It's about rebuilding yourself with your courage, your self-respect, and your dignity, because that's what brings the change about. Because when you have those things, you don't take BS from other people.
Gerald Celente, thanks so much for coming on the show today and giving us your message. You're a very powerful thinker and analyst and, as I say, prognosticator, too, about what's happening and also what could happen in this country. And all I can say is keep doing what you're doing.
Well, thank you. And you, too. Thank you so much for all you do.
Bye-bye, Gerald.
Bye.
Well, thanks so much for listening to the Lew Rockwell Show today. Take a look at all the podcasts. There have been hundreds of them. There's a link on the upper right-hand corner of the LRC front page. Thank you.